this kind of acceptance of death makes them outside the ability of Israeli power to enact itself. So the intensity of violence actually represents Israel losing control. It doesn't represent Israel actually maintaining.
The Electronic Intifada.
The Electronic Intifada.
The Electronic Intifada.
This is the Electronic Intifada podcast. I'm Nora Barrows-Friedman.
And I'm Asa Winstanley.
Welcome back to the Electronic Intifada podcast, and welcome to our first episode of 2023. Today, we're joined by Abdeljawad Hamayel, a PhD student and lecturer in the Philosophy and Cultural Studies Department at Birzeit University in Palestine, to talk about the current situation on the ground in the occupied West Bank. As our senior editor Maureen Murphy reported, in January alone, Israeli police, soldiers, and settlers killed at least 35 Palestinians, including 7 children in the West Bank, as the violent repression in the territory that escalated throughout 2022 carried into the new year. Those deaths include 10 Palestinians who were fatally injured during a raid in Jenin refugee camp, the single deadliest operation in the West Bank since at least 2005, according to a UN official. The uptick in fatalities followed a series of deadly attacks in Israel during March of 2022, several of them carried out by Palestinians from the Jenin area of the northern West Bank, which has seen a resurgence in armed resistance against Israel's regime of apartheid, occupation, and settler colonization. Since then, the Jenin area has endured almost daily raids, resulting in dozens of deaths. On January 26th, Israeli forces killed 9 Palestinians during a raid in Jenin refugee camp. A 10th Palestinian died from his injuries days later. 2 children and a 61-year-old woman were among those killed in the Jenin raid. 20 Palestinians were injured, 4 of them critically, according to the health ministry. Al-Haq, a Palestinian human rights group, said that the raid began with a siege on a home in the camp. 3 occupants of the building were killed by Israeli shelling. The military also bulldozed part of a community organization in the camp and targeted electricity generators, cutting off power and internet in the area, including to the main hospital in Jenin, according to the rights group. Palestinians in Gaza fired rockets toward Israel following the deadly Jenin raid, and Israel hit sites in Gaza that it claimed were used to manufacture rockets. That was from our Palestine in Pictures monthly report by our editor, Maureen Murphy. We'll have the link to that in the blog post that accompanies this episode. Abud Hamayel, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm glad to be here.
We're really glad you're here too. Can you talk about the last month in the West Bank in particular and what you've observed yourself in terms of the escalation in Israeli attacks and the current atmosphere on the ground?
The current situation is as follows, is that in the West Bank, there's a rise of new spaces of resistance, if you want to call them, they have made life harder for the Israeli military to enter and arrest and exercise the power of arrest, which has been going on for the past decade or so without much resistance. And these spaces have mostly been basically self-defense type of revolutionary positioning. So they're not acting or enacting a lot of offensive operations. They mostly handle the military when they enter these areas. And this has created a situation where Israel is just not having it. So they're going in and exercising, instead of the power of the arrest, a power of death, of killing, and of creating this, what you rendered just previously, the intensity of death that is happening in the West Bank is a direct result of that. So this is what's happening at this point. We can talk about why these spaces rose and how they rose and what they tell us about Palestine, economics, etc. But at least in terms of the tactical and military conversation, we're seeing basically self-defense zones defending themselves against an Israeli military that is attempting to kill them in
Yeah, let's talk about why they've reappeared in especially areas in the northern West Bank, in Jenin and in Nablus, where the Lion's Den is located and is defending the communities there. Especially like in terms of the the lack of real defense by the Palestinian Authority, which is supposed to be in charge of defending Palestinians in the West Bank. But as we all know, the Palestinian Authority has remained basically a subcontractor of the Israeli occupation. In the last week or so, we saw the PA announce that it would be pausing its so-called security coordination with Israel. They've said that before, and of course, no pause was happened. Can you talk about what it really the role of the Palestinian Authority and how that fits into the context of what we're seeing with the Lion's Den, for example, other resistance factions really stepping in to provide civilian defense?
I mean, it's a long story, but to make it short, I mean, I think the PA is central to all of this. The PA since 2006, because in the Second Intifada, it was basically mostly destroyed as at least an institutional existence and was resurrected in an attempt to provide, again, the Israelis with the power to expand in terms of territorial settlement expansion, etc., while the PA handles the people, the Palestinian people living in the West Bank, specifically, excluding Jerusalem, of course. So in this sense, what we had is this kind of dual role where you have a military occupation that enables settlement expansion and a PA which deals with the people's civil issues, security coordination, and other realm. But the PA has always sold the Palestinians a very ideological stance that this current situation is only temporary, that it's working towards a realization of a state, and that its realization of the state is built on this strategy of legal internationalization or lawfare, that it's built on pressuring EU, the US to interfere in the conflict by proving their ability to maintain security on the ground. The idea was that eventually the Europeans and the Americans will come in and give us a state. And that never really, I mean, since 2012, the EU, the UN, a lot of international organizations declared Palestine ready to become a state, but the state never actually borne fruit. So you have this situation where its basic ideological premise that it sells to the people basically is crumbling. Therefore, we're seeing this kind of unbinding process, if you want, from the PA, even among Fatah cadres who are somewhat tied to the PA, at least present or represent the social base on which the PA relies to maintain its control, its social power in society. And particularly the north of the West Bank, beyond its long history of resistance to the Israelis and the Zionist colonization. I mean, it goes back before 48. Beyond that memory of resistance that plays a role in its resurgence today, has not been really essential part of PA planning, economic development, institutional building. So you also have this kind of neglect that are also, have a lot of social antagonisms about how the PA dealt with its, placing Ramallah as a central place for its existence, where all the ministries are, where most of its developmental aid goes to, and actually drawing a lot of people from areas like Jenin and Nablus to work into Ramallah, no? So actually the people who might serve as, let's say, an echo of PA ideology in the north of the West Bank are mostly living in Ramallah, which means that we can see the north of the West Bank as one of the areas where PA ideological power, social presence is the weakest. And therefore, it provides, under the current situation on the ground, the pretext for why a lot of these new movements are rising and, holding arms, developing the self-defense strategy that I talked about. I mean, it goes also to the presence of other Palestinian militant groups like the Islamic Jihad, Hamas, people who are in Fatah but are unhappy about the current leadership, or other parts of Palestinian political parties that are basically pushing for a new configuration, a new presence on the ground. One that is built, generally speaking, on a new generation of Palestinians, people from 18 to 35, who are willing to take up and who are presenting or representing this kind of new spirit of resistance in different ways. We can also talk about that later, but at least my reading is that the north of the West Bank seems a logical place for such a resistance in its current form as a self-defense zone. I mean, because remember, resistance does exist everywhere else, but it takes just different forms. But in the north of the West Bank, it's one of these places where the social marginalization of these places, the ideological unbinding from the PA, but also a hugely important point, which is the existence of a lot of refugee camps, old cities. And these are very narrow spaces, or cramped spaces, if you want, which enable the development of like a self-defense, civilians, armed, and capable of engagement, military engagement with the Israeli army. So, I mean, these cramped spaces are the hot resistance right now,
Right.
because they present like a cover, a social, but also an urban cover for these resistance fighters who are attempting this kind of self-defense zone making in the north of the West Bank. Yeah.
Right. And, consequently, Israel is doing, I mean, the massacre that happened in Jenin just a few weeks ago, where, Israeli jets were, dropping missiles on Jenin, which hasn't happened for, more than a decade and a half. The reaction by the Israeli apartheid government and also the PA has been pretty vicious. And what happens during a massacre like that? What is the intention of Israel? And how is the resistance maintaining despite all of these attacks against it?
I mean, what enables resistance is this like position that the resistance fighter is taking in the Palestinian context right now. I mean, what we see with this new generation is this unwillingness to actually surrender or negotiate. I mean, it does happen sometimes, but mostly they're unafraid of death. They have this wager with death. They accept that they might die. They accept this probability. And that's what makes them very and perhaps revolutionary, like, because this kind of acceptance of death makes them outside the ability of Israeli power to enact itself. So the intensity of violence actually represents Israel losing control. It doesn't represent Israel actually maintaining control. I mean, to retain control, it uses this, Israeli power, air power, and discussions over how to tactically kill these groups, intelligence information on these groups, special forces and the use of it, whether there should be a large-scale military operation, or whether they should just sustain this kind of like pressure on these groups by creating like special type of operations that they enter refugee camps or the old city in Nablus, targeting a specific, let's say, cell, and then they leave. The Israelis are attempting different mix of tactics, but what is essential here is that for the first time, at least in 16 years, you have hundreds of Palestinians, if not more, and a surrounding environment that accepts this wager with death. And that's why that you see Israelis acting the way they act. And I think it also has reasons with Israeli mentality when it comes to like enacting military operations. They don't want to lose any soldier. They want to go in without having anybody killed. So they enact operations where they use heavy fire have heavy firepower. Remember, most of these fighters didn't ever actually kill an Israeli, didn't ever actually commit operations that actually led to any Israeli death. But despite that, they're treated with this kind of heavy-handed military, and security mentality by the Israelis. This insistence in Israel on like protecting its soldiers means that when they enter in any area, they're willing to use firepower, mostly indiscriminate, and it leads to these to what happened a week ago or 10 days ago in Jenin of 10 people being killed in one operation and a lot of other people being injured severely, etc. So this is the problem. This is the dynamic that is happening. And I think, historically, Israel has lost some of its, let's say, heroism, its capability of entering areas, land areas. There's an Israeli insecurity about this. In Lebanon, they were defeated. In Gaza, it wasn't easy. And therefore, this type of heavy-handed approach, policy, comes also from this long history of actually meeting resistance fighters in Lebanon, Gaza, and other places, and being defeated on the ground, at least. So I mean, this reliance on like firepower, on air power, is partially the result of this failure, of this historical failure. So they're using their technologies, their good intelligence, special operations, go in and out without any injuries on their soldiers, and therefore they're willing to commit whatever is necessary to do that as a military power. Yeah.
Right. I mean, they thought that they had successfully quelled the resistance in the West Bank, for the last 16, 17 years. Can you talk about this new generation of fighters that you mentioned, and how these factions are emerging with relative success at this point?
I mean, there's a lot of discussion about, how you can measure success, because success always is like a very, let's say, instrumental, rationalist type of like thinking, no? It comes to the rise of this new generation, I think, and this is actually an Israeli reading. The Israelis read this as, this is a generational fight. We have a new generation of Palestinians. These guys are not scared to die. And we need to remind them of Israeli power. And we need to remind them of what Israel could do. We need to create yet another trauma. And therefore, again, this goes back to our earlier question of why the use of, firepower in the way Israel is using it. I mean, this new generation of Palestinians that has not been a witness to the second intifada or the first intifada, has not been truly arrested or gone through the motions of warning or gone through the motions of interrogations in Israeli prisons. This new, fresh, if we want to say, generation of people that, that has this like will to power, will to engage the Israeli military, need to be reminded of Israel's power, of Israel's military capabilities, of intelligence, of Israel's ability to kill, to choose who to kill, to choose who not to kill. And therefore you see this kind of like also enactment of trauma on the, why Israelis are, excessively using firepower, and not only in Jenin and Nablus, actually all over, the West Bank, because they're reading it somewhat as a generational fight that they need to win. They need to make sure that this new generation of Palestinians also understand that they cannot be successful, that they cannot challenge Israel's power in the West Bank, that they cannot make a difference, and therefore this excessive use of killing, arrest, etc. And I mean, if you look at the last year, the policy has been an expansion of arrests, even what is called in Israel like administrative detention, which is a form of preventive arrest. It's attempting to kill any form of political leadership arising around this form of struggle by choosing people who they think might provide the infrastructure for the rise of a new leadership, a leadership that could prove an alternative to the current PA leadership and the class interest it represents. So at this moment, the Israeli strategy of containment and of maintaining pressure on these self-defense zones, of these new spaces of resistance, and attempting to close, the wall at the beginning of the year, make sure the security wall is actually a security wall, like that no Palestinian could enter into the heart of the settlements in 1948. This whole policy that they see it as something that is going to escalate, as something that is going to roll on in the next couple of months, even years, and therefore they need to be ready, and therefore they're kind of like trying to eat Palestinians for lunch before Palestinians eat them for dinner. I mean, that's the logic,
Yeah.
I'm not sure if it's going to work because they're also creating the space and the escalation in the conflict.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Abu Hamayel, part of this, like, this escalation of violence is, I mean, it's part and parcel of like what a settler colony does. It deputizes its citizens to be part of the, security apparatus. We see this now just in the last week. The Israeli government announced that it would be expanding licenses for personal firearms for Israeli settlers. And this is, I actually was surprised. I didn't think there were many licenses to begin with, or or restrictions on like how many firearms Israelis can carry. But what does this signify in terms of like national and political policy with this new Israeli government, and what could be the result of like the escalation of literal firearms in the hands of Israeli settlers?
It's actually ironic because in many cases where they expanded the existence of firepower, you saw Israelis killing Israelis, no? I mean, and mistaking,
Right.
another Israeli. Israeli society is also like conflicted. It has different ethnicities and groups, and a Yemenite Jew or a Sephardic Jew is different than Ashkenazi, and this creates a lot of different problems. And it happened actually repeatedly, where this fear of the rise of, let's say, another form of resistance in the past couple of years, which was based on what is called in, like, let's say, military literature, like the lone wolf phenomenon. I mean, I think it's a wrong description of this phenomenon. But what's happening is that beyond these self-defense zones, and this is what happened after Jenin, you saw operations happening in the heart of Jerusalem, in East Jerusalem, in the settlement of Nevi Yaakov and other places. So Israelis, in their war in the north of the West Bank, are getting also, attacks by Palestinians in the south of, in the Negev, in the heart of Tel Aviv, in Jerusalem, in other places. And one of the most important elements of that is that they cannot actually predict it. Intelligence doesn't work here, because it's not an organized phenomenon. It's not actually have predictive capacity or infiltrate a specific group or understand the specific organization and its network of operations. It's somebody who has the will to go and enact an operation, and Israel just doesn't have a real response for that. So you see this kind of like spiraling of different policies where Israel is trying to maintain what it calls harta'a in Hebrew, or what is it called, deterrence. So if somebody attacks Israelis or settlements or settlers or soldiers, we're gonna like kidnap his body. That's the first thing. We're gonna make his family pay a price, a very tribal approach as well. You killed one of us, so we're gonna like make your family hurt. It's also something that is under international law, rejected, under any law, actually, is also rejected.
It's collective punishment, right?
Collective punishment. Closing or destroying somebody's house. Now they're talking about maybe deporting people or doing other type of stuff, increasing the presence of what you just said, licenses for guns. So this kind of this kind of spiraling of policy of trying to maintain like some sort of deterrence, despite its failure historically, despite that it didn't really actually create the deterrence that they wanted to create, means they're in a very hard position. No? It means that they don't really know what to do. They don't really know how to solve this problem. They don't really know how to solve this phenomenon. And that shows the weakness of the current Israeli mentality of dealing with the Palestinian issue only on a security military basis. So it's not a political issue, it's just a security issue. And they can enact whatever security issue they want, but as we see over and over again throughout the history of Palestinian confrontation with Israeli colonialism, since the first Zionist settler came in, resistance has just a way of coming back in different forms, in different generations, different Palestinians, and it has a way of of exploiting these type of weaknesses, even on the level of what we just said, this lone wolf phenomenon that is, and they have no real answer to.
Finally, let's talk a little bit about how you're seeing the situation kind of unfolding. I know it's impossible to predict or to speculate, but based on what we're seeing with as we mentioned, like the resurgence of these West Bank factions, with Gaza continuing to be a pretty strong force against Israeli colonization, and with this new generation being willing to fight. How do you see also and with the Palestinian Authority and the state that it is, continuing to sell out, continuing to work with Israel and the EU and the US and Canada. How do you see the situation playing out as best you can predict at this point?
I mean, I think this is the problem of the space that we are in historically. It's one where you see resistance resurging, but you don't see, at least in current discourse around resistance, and even among the resistance fighters themselves or among the wider society, a sort of futurity, like something we can actually build on politically. Where does this lead us? What is possible politically to achieve? So this is one of the problems of fighting in the current moment, and this is why I think it's also like one of these unique moments that people are fighting despite the fact that these large-scale narrative of retaining Palestine or liberation or it's these type of meta narratives have lost their capacity and power to ignite people's imagination. Remember that years that one of the we can read resistance currently developing as a symptom of PA weakness, on a social level, on an economic level, or on an ideological level. But it still retains a lot of its power, as two things going on for it. The incapacity of Palestinians to think of an alternative to the PA. It's a very crippling. We just don't have an answer, a concrete answer of what to do if the PA doesn't exist anymore, specifically on an economic level, specifically because it employs 32% of the Palestinian workforce. And this type of economic power and incapacity to think of an alternative is quite crippling on a political level. What do you do without the PA? How would you organize society without the PA? I mean, this is one of the elements that makes this moment a moment where I think we're gonna see kind of resistance coexisting with another form of continuity in the horizon of a consumer society that has malls in Palestine, of a day-to-day life that people are basically clinging on, a sense of like clinging to the PA because at least we can survive Israeli power. And you can see it, Nora, because I mean, even the PA discourse coming from its leaders justifying security coordination at this moment is one where it says like, look, security coordination protects you from Israeli death, protects you from Israeli power, protects you from Israeli ability to go crazy, thing where what we can do is only cooperate with the enemy to maintain our bare existence, and this is something, this is also a form of ideological power that maintains the PA, but still there's a process of unbinding happening, a process where people are rejecting that, a process that we can see becoming material in terms of like the rise of resisting groups and their power. So I see them kind of coexisting together. I see resistance and the day-to-day life moving on, at least for the moment. I don't see intifada in the way we saw it historically in the first intifada or even in the second intifada. I see a reluctance among people to go all in, but I see also a willingness of these, that the return of this capacity to act in the world, this capacity to resist, what will it actually lead to? So I think this is the type of like scenario that I see, at least for the next couple of months or the next year or so. I mean, but anything could happen. Predicting the future is always something.
You have to go with caution on that one. Yeah, of course. Especially in Palestine, things can change in an instant.
Yeah. I mean, but it also doesn't mean that we don't have, these flashes, this spontaneous rise of like large scale rebellions. But the problem is, how do you sustain them? That's a different question. They could rise, but they could also, easily fade away. I mean, and I see that also reappearing, but I don't see it necessarily being able to fade itself in a very uniform way, in a different rhythm. But I think things has been since 2012. In 2012 there was not a single operation or Israeli killed or injured in a single operation coming from the West Bank the whole year. It was one of the quietest years in the history of the Israeli occupation from the eyes of, let's say, Israeli intelligence and Israeli military and Israeli security establishment. And since 2012, we have this slow but intensifying resurgence of resistance in different forms, in terms of demonstrations, large-scale rebellions in Jerusalem, within even 1948, among 1948 Palestinians, and also in the West Bank, taking these varied forms, West Bank or in other areas throughout. So this intensity, this intensification is happening, and it's rapidly increasing. The PA is losing power every day. Its infighting is also making it even weaker. But still, I still think that the PA is more powerful than people give it, give it credence. It has this economic power, it has this binding power to it, and it has this capacity to make us not think of an alternative to it. So this is one of the problems that we have on, at least on a political level. How can we fill, our imagination? What could we do politically? What is possible? There's still something that nobody can really answer.
I think that's a good place to leave it. Abdel Jawad Hamayel, you are a PhD student and a lecturer at Birzeit University in the West Bank in Palestine. We'd love to have you on again. Thank you so much for joining us today on the Electronic Intifada podcast.
Thank you, Nora. Thank you. I'm glad to be with you again.
The title of my little talk here, Know Where You Stand and Stand There, comes from a commencement address by my friend and tutor and mentor, Father Dan Berrigan, Actually, it doesn't come from that commencement address. It is the sum and total of his commencement address. He was asked by a very prestigious university to come and give the commencement addresses about 4 decades ago. And he came and he stood up there and he said those words, "Know where you stand and stand there." And then he very politely left and sat down with the audience. That's all you really need to know, folks. You need to know where you stand and stand there. Now, sometimes we're a little worried, nonviolence is good, but sometimes when we put ourselves in other people's faces and they react with a very great anger, we too are tempted to get angry, not only at their reaction, but at the whole concept of the widespread injustice throughout the world. And so I would just encourage us all to remember that anger is a virtue. None other than Thomas Aquinas said so. He said, anger is a virtue, but you have to have just so much of it. He warned against too much anger, iracundia, always being ticked off. That was the Latin word, okay? But he also warned about unreasoned patience. That's the best we could do from the Latin, okay? He said, unreasoned patience sows the seeds of vice, nourishes negligence, and encourages good people to tolerate bad people, or the bad things that people do. I don't really think there are bad people. And so what we need to do here is figure out how to act nonviolently and with just the right dosage of the virtue of anger. Now, I'm not the greatest representative of what is now called by Jose Vega and others interventions. Yeah, interventions in the same sense of the word. People are pretty crazy in Washington. But I'll give you some personal examples of how I tried to stand up and do what Dan Berrigan suggested. May we have the first slide, please? Okay, this is a photo of me standing up, turning my back to Hillary Clinton, who you can see off my left shoulder. And she was talking about repression in Iran. And suffice to say, there was great repression exercised on me simply for standing up, not saying a word, non-violently again, but angry. And I was beat up pretty bad, but I didn't even have to stay in jail that night. I got to go home. I had to go to the hospital first. And interestingly enough, the doctor said, "Now, you were beaten up. You have to report this to the authorities." I said, to State Department of Security? They did it. Okay. So that was number one. Maybe we have the second slide, please. Okay, here I wasn't so lucky. I did have to spend the night in jail. That's okay. Good things happen in jail. You get to feel what other people feel, being all closed up and unfree. Now, what are the lessons here? Well, this particular photo was taken after I stood up and intervened, so to speak, with the Senate Intelligence Committee before they approved the nomination of Torturer-in-Chief Jenin to be the new CIA director 5 or 6 years ago. What encouraged me to do that? Well, just the obscenity of the whole thing. I mean, hello. So what do you do in situations like that? Well, number one, you kind of, as you can see, you blend in with the indigenous to get in, right? You put your best wedding suit on, which I had, okay? Number two, you stay away from known interveners, Code Pink, for example. You let them sit over in the court. You you go separately, okay? Number 3, you hope that one of those code pickers has a camera, and indeed one did. Therefore, this picture after they had taken me out of the hearing room. And what I have is number 4 here. Yeah, I was just thinking today, people have been asking me, what's this green band you have on there, Ray? Let me read it to you. Rachel Corrie, April 10, 1979, March 16, 2003. Suffice it to say that if 23-year-old Rachel Corrie can stand up to Israeli bulldozers about to demolish yet another Palestinian home, and then that Israeli bulldozer being instructed to back up over Rachel to make sure that her back was broken 3 days before the attack on Iraq, so it would not make the headlines. Well, if Rachel Corrie could do that, McGovern, you can do that too. At least you're not going to get run over, yet at least, by an Israeli bulldozer. So we Catholics call this a sacramental, something that reminds you of a grace-giving event or a grace-giving thing, or a grace-giving person like Rachel Corrie. Her dad gave me this bracelet 3 months after she was killed. I want to also suggest that those of you who are interested in taking some action, go to all the think tank presentations as Jose Vega has started to do. Here's one that I'd like to show you. There's a little clip of a event at John Podesta and Hillary Clinton's old think tank. Sometimes I got to ask questions. They were never welcome. This time they didn't recognize me. They didn't let me ask a question, but I hung around, you might say. Nevertheless, I persisted. So I went up to this Adam Schiff, then head of the House Intelligence Committee, and I asked him about Russian hacking, which now has been conclusively disproven. Now, could we show this 2-minute clip? If you fall asleep, you'll miss the whole thing. May we have that 2-minute clip?
Schiff, my name is Ray McGovern. I served in CIA under 7 presidents and 9 directors.
Well, thank you very much.
We have a little alumni group called Veteran Intelligence Professionals for Sanity, and we've been following this issue very closely. One of our members is the former technical director of NSA. I'm interested in 1 week ago when the president said this, I don't want to misquote him. The conclusions of the intelligence community with respect to Russian hacking were not conclusive regarding WikiLeaks. In other words, there's a big gap between alleged Russian hacking and WikiLeaks. The intelligence community does not know how or if that information, to the degree it exists, got to WikiLeaks. Now, you assert as flat fact that Russia did this. Do you know more than Obama?
Well, I would never claim to know more than Obama. I think he's a brilliant man.
It's a very serious question.
No, it's a serious question. I have every confidence in the intelligence of the Russian hacking of both the DNC as well as John Podesta.
James Clapper is a convicted...
You asked me a question. Do you want to hear the answer?
I will.
While I can't go into the classified information, I have every confidence that the Russians used WikiLeaks, whether Julian Assange was a knowing participant or, as the Russians would describe, a useful idiot. That we will hopefully find out, but I don't have any question in the conclusions that the intelligence.
You have every confidence, but no evidence. Is that right?
No, I can't share the evidence with you.
Yeah,
Congressman?
I'm
Paul
that's
Joy.
bogus.
I'm former
That's bogus.
Director of Security Senate Intelligence Committee. We always refer to it as the SSCI, the Intelligence.
Well, I have to concede now, after all these years, that Schiff said one thing that was true, and that is that he couldn't share that information with me because it didn't exist. Now, what's the lesson here? I just want to encourage everyone, go to these meetings, go to these think tanks, and nevertheless persist. I didn't know the camera was still on. I didn't know that C-SPAN still had audio, but I did it, and I'm glad because that was captured. Now, what else? I'm going to read in conclusion a poem written by my mentor, Dan Berrigan, a quote from whom we started this little talk. It's called Some. I don't want to spoil it for you. It's not very long, but I do want to have a photo up as backdrop. Could we have that slide number 4, please? Some stood up once and sat down. Some walked a mile and walked away. Some stood up twice, then sat down. I've had it, they said. Some walked 2 miles, then walked away. It's too much, they cried. Some stood and stood and stood. They were taken for fools. They were taken for having been taken in. Some walked and walked and walked. They walked the earth. They walked the skies. They walked the waters. Why do you stand? They were asked, and why do you walk? Because of the children. Because of the children, they said, and because of the heart, because of the bread, because the cause is the heart's beat, and the children born, and the risen bread. You're looking at a little boy, 2 years old, the age of our youngest of 10 grandchildren, who was trying to escape the oppression, the war in Syria. He was of Kurdish origin, the stepchildren of all wars. And suffice it to say, he drowned with his big brother and his mother trying to get to Greece. Alan Kurdi is his name. Because of the children, they said. So, nevertheless, we must persist because of the children. And we must look for moral leadership, but absent moral leadership, we're it. There's no other but us. Now we can appeal, for example, I have appealed to Pope Francis, and that's appeared on the largest religious network run by Catholics. It's just up. You can see it on my website, raymcgovern.com. But we can't wait. We can't wait for a voice from the Vatican. We have to do what we can ourselves. And that's why I applaud and I welcome the chance to be on every Schiller conference to which I'm invited. And I applaud all of us, and particularly Helga, for exercising moral leadership at this critical point in time. Thanks very much for your attention.
Yes, I mean, if you ask me whether the relationship with nature is important and people who are deprived of it have some sort of a deficit, and there is in fact we're inventing conditions all the time, but there is now something called nature deficit disorder, and it's real. I would say very profoundly so. There is now an enormous amount of evidence of various kinds that people who are brought up in a wholly urban environment and have no connection with nature have many kind of problems, higher levels of anxiety, depression, aggression, anger, cognitive impairments. They're not able to think and concentrate in the way that otherwise they might be. relationship disorders, and generally dysfunctional people. So it is very important, and I'm a patron of a trust called the Fathom Trust, the purpose of which is to help people from backgrounds where they have no contact either with nature or the way of life that would involve working with animals and the traditions of the countryside, to take them to a place where they can begin to understand this and actually have effects on their mental health. It does more than that. It takes stressed out professionals and helps them back into a more normal and fulfilled frame of mind. But it is a very important thing. And in the writing of The Master and His Emissary, I came across a very large body of literature that suggests that our relations with one another are becoming impoverished, and that this is part of why there is so much mental illness. And I presented a lot of that information in what is effectively the last chapter of that book. And there are some interesting studies on immigrants going into America who come from traditional backgrounds where they tend to eat together, worship together, know one another, share one another's lives. And they arrive contrary to what might be thought from wherever it might be. In America, it's quite often Mexico, with actually a low level of mental illness. After they've been there about 20 years, they begin to have higher levels of mental illness. And after a generation, they share the same very high rates of mental illness of the host population in America. There's also evidence that immigrant communities, such as an Italian community that preserved itself on the east coast of America, despite eating, drinking, smoking in ways that we wouldn't have thought healthy, and not necessarily taking the prescribed amount of exercise, that they had lower levels not just of mental illness but of physical illness, because they had preserved the aspects of their home culture and community, which again shared family, worship, eating together, common values. And this combination of the relationship between ourselves as humans and our relationship with the natural world are two very important relationships that have global effects on our health. But as I discovered, I didn't come to this with any preformed idea that there would be any evidence, but I just thought, let me look if there is any evidence about the effects of what I can only call, it's an unsatisfactory phrase, but a spiritual or religious cast of mind, belief, or culture. And the answer is it has an even greater effect than either of the other two. It is the single most powerful predictor of human happiness, and not having such a relationship with another realm means that you are very much less resilient when facing, as we all do, opposition, hardship, and difficulties in life. One is much more prone to anxiety, depression, and a sense of loneliness. And one is much less able to defend oneself against physical illness as well. So the effect of belonging to a group of people who share a common faith and express it together is stronger than going to the gym every day and stopping smoking and watching your blood pressure. So these things are very, very real. Now, I mean, of course, I've cast it as though these things are utilitarian, because the utilitarian way of thinking is the only way in which we evaluate something. Is this useful or is it not? That's a terribly primitive way of thinking. It is the left hemisphere's only value, utility or pleasure. Pleasure is another form of utility. But the right hemisphere sees the world which has many other values, that it has, there are important things like truth, love, beauty, justice, magnanimity, bravery. These things are undervalued these days. but they are incredibly important. So we've moved into a world in which we're told nothing has a meaning. We're isolated behind our screens. We don't have common ways of socializing in the way that earlier, more traditional societies had. And our lives are devoid of, I'm generalizing here widely, and of course it won't apply to many people, but in general, modern urban Western life tends to be deficient in those relationships of society, nature, and the spiritual. And so what you would predict is exactly what we see, an enormous rise in mental health problems. And to put this into perspective, because people say, well, we're much more willing to diagnose them nowadays, and I think that's just a cultural thing. Nobody asked in the past. Well, there is some wonderful research that gets around all of that. The American psychologist Jean Twenge has studied children at a certain age in their mid-teens at school because records have been kept for every class since 1930 through to, I think, 2007 when the study was done. And when you compare, people answered questions about their happiness, their sense of loneliness, all those questions, 100 questions about themselves and how they relate to the world. And so you can objectively, and without the effect of the retrospectoscope, you can see how did they score, how do children now score. And what she found is that children now score 5 to 8 times as high, not 5 to 8% more, which would already be a worry, but 5 to 8 times the score. That is to describe an utterly pathological society.
Viruses are amazing molecular machines that are much tinier than even the smallest cells. We often think of viruses, like the flu, chickenpox, or herpes, as external invaders. But viruses are more inherently associated with human life than we often realize. Even after recovering from a viral infection, there will always be a piece of that virus encoded within your DNA. Approximately 8% of the human genome is made up of endogenous retroviruses, which are viral gene sequences that have become a permanent part of the human lineage after they infected our ancient ancestors. And these endogenous retroviruses don't just sit silently in the genome. Their expression has been implicated in diseases like autoimmune disorders and breast cancer. But endogenous retroviruses can also be extremely useful for human survival. For example, they play a very important role as an interface between a pregnant mother and her fetus by regulating placental development and function. It has been suggested that viruses are not only necessary for the existence of placental mammals, but also for the existence of life in general. Professor Louis P. Villarreal, the founding director of the Center for Virus Research at UC Irvine, says it like this: "So powerful and ancient are viruses that I would summarize their role in life as ex virus omnia, from virus everything."